And that's something very important because usually debt is linked to projects, right? Not always, but usually linked to projects. So the first risk I see as Minister of Finance here is government overpaying for projects. And the way we mitigate that risk is to make sure that we have robust, strong, and transparent budgeting and public procurement processes. Otherwise, you spend money on project, you overpay the project, and you accumulate unnecessary debt. So that's the first risk I see. The second one is what I call the mismatch between the asset and liability. In our region, West African region, we have instances where, due to the pressure from the population, government are going to local market to get short-term debt to finance long-term projects. That creates the mismatch. So, and the way you mitigate those type of risks is you actually proactively work on your debt portfolio. That's what we did last year when we went through a debt reprofiling using the credit enhancing facility mechanism and also using the World Bank partial guarantee product to actually raise long-term debt for over 10 years with a rate around 3% to replace short-term debt with a rate around 7% plus. So that's answer to that risk. The third risk I see here is the FX risk, foreign currency risk. In our countries, we have several lenders and export credit agencies coming to us with proposals. So we need to be careful on the exposure we're taking because by diversifying the source of financing, we're taking FX risk. In Benin, for example, we have a very stringent debt management framework. And for us, we don't want to be exposed over 20% on FX risk. That's why a few weeks ago, when we completed our inaugural Eurobond issuance, we actually decided to go with Euro, whereas most of the investors, and I can see some of them in the room here, were pushing us to go to dollar. And as a matter of fact, the dollar market is deeper than the Euro market. And that was something unique because that's the first time in the whole Africa where you have a country getting to the international bond market and asking for Euro instead of dollar. And we did that because we're very clear that we don't want to have exposure to FX exceeding 20% of our whole debt portfolio. And then the other risk I can see here is the legal risk. And I'm actually glad that I have law professors, expert on law and debt restructuring situation. Because, we believe that right now, many countries are going to the international loan market. The bond market is fine, we have framework, etc. But when it's come to international loan market, usually banks tend to use the Loan Market Association framework, which is a framework designed for corporates, not for public debt and for sovereign. Last year, we went to international market, we signed a couple of loans, and I can tell you that every single time, the first draft of agreement we're getting was based on that private sector debt agreement framework, and we had to spend a lot of hours. It was a big legal battle, to protect the government, because we don't have a clear framework for international loan for sovereign. So we spent hours discussing situation where or how we can actually restrict the ability for lenders to sell the right to distressed debt funds, what we call 402. We also spent hours discussing terms around cross default, to make sure that, just not because we have a technical default, then all the debts need to be called. Okay. So the legal risk is key. In absence of a clear framework, we want to make sure that governments, when they go into international loan market, they're paying lawyers big money to make sure that we actually protecting ourselves to future. Yeah. The key here is government, they don't see the immediate benefits of doing that. Yeah. But the point is, you have to do it at the beginning. Otherwise, when the crisis comes, you spend time and a lot of effort trying to resolve the issue. Okay. So that's the key risk I want to mention.
Thank you. Dr. Lee now. In fact, I could turn to you now.
Yes, of course. So thanks very much for inviting me to join this panel. So I would echo all of the comments that have just been made. And I would also add to that some additional things I'm thinking about, some risks at the global level. I think I would mention that there is a risk of greater systemic risk. There's been a sort of a fairly large range of mergers and acquisitions after 2008, so financial institutions actually could be relatively integrated. And also you have sort of the softening of some range of financial regulations that might also be increasing some of the systemic risk in the market that I think is worth maybe paying attention to. One thing that I think we've seen recently is a sort of rise of humanitarian crises in response to natural disasters. And I think that might be something sort of projecting forward that maybe we need to be paying more attention to, especially given the sort of
order filled
of climate change. And of course, that impacts the risk on both the debt payment side in terms of undermining the ability to actually make payments to make sure export commodity markets are working well, and also thinking in terms of the needs of the countries themselves. So that would be another thing I would think of. Also, to use a sort of famous phrase at this point, I think known unknowns. It seems like we have encountered, I'm thinking of, for example, the tuna debt scandal, encountered a range of situations in which all of a sudden there are hidden loans or liabilities that we were unaware of. And, so kind of thinking ahead to that, I think is something worth paying attention to. And I would also echo, I think, what both of you said in terms of the increased risk from creditor fragmentation, from different ranges of creditors, some of whom have less experience or less background in terms of working through the collective restructuring processes that have been put in place. And I think the ongoing risk of holdout creditor litigation is significant. It is rare, but the rarity does not necessarily speak to import. I think you can have something that is rare that is still impacting the ways in which creditors and debtors are interacting and how debtors decide to accept or reject particular solutions. And also when that risk does actually emerge, it has a very substantial impact on the likelihood of restructuring and on the sort of economic growth that can result from the restructuring. Do I have time to speak a little bit about mitigating, or are we running low?
We'll come back to you.
Very well.
Dr. Bokosi.
Thank you very much. The risk is there, and I come from Africa, so I like using stories and stuff. It's the risk that's there is simply, imagine somebody on a sinking ship, and you want to jump out. So you either stay in, which is a risk, or you jump into the water when you don't know how to swim. It's exactly where we are in Africa now. You are jumping from a burning house, 10 stories up, you don't know where you're going to land. And that's the way I look at it. Why do I say that? If you look at the trajectory a few years ago, everybody was talking about Africa rising, So everybody growing up in Africa assumed that within 5 years, we're going to be somewhere else. A few years down the line, we are now talking about the debt crisis, Africa debt crisis. Some of us who grew up in the early 80s know that it was called the Third World Debt Crisis. Now it's only the African debt crisis. So there is a risk. What is the risk? The risk is in terms of, if you look at the debt repayments alone, between 2010 and 2018, they have increased by 85%. Now, if you take 124 developing countries that are developing countries, if you look at the top 15 in terms of debt repayments, you discover that in those top 10, 15 countries, 10 countries out of the 15 have experienced public expenditure reduction per capita. So public expenditure per capita has actually reduced in 10 of the top 15 countries that are actually in debt problems. If you take the 15 that have less debt problems, that are making less debt repayments, it's only 2 countries that the public expenditure per person has actually gone down. On average, public expenditure per person has actually increased by 11%. And that tells you that there is a risk that if we don't deal with this debt problem, we are risking missing out on the sustainable development goals. We are risking creating more problems as we go along. And the problem is that we are using the same instruments to attack a beast that has actually changed. So we are not going to have another HIPIC because the nature of the beast has completely changed. And as Mr. Lipton has said and the minister said, you now have more private creditors. You have China in the mix, which is not a member of the Paris Club. The total share of the Paris Club is actually low. You have bonds, African countries who a couple of years ago would not even dream of going to the international market. But here, every time, including my minister here, is saying how proud he is. He went to the international market and we actually got money. That tells you that the beast has changed. The risk I face is that we have a beast that has changed in its nature, in its character, and we still want to use the instruments of dealing with that beast that we used in the early 80s, in the early 90s. And that's a huge risk that we have to mitigate. And finally, what I'm going to say is that one of the things that we should not do is exactly what happened in the past. Mexico defaulted in 1982. It was only in 1996 that the first HIPIC actually came. 14 years, and in those 14 years, children were dying, people were dying, and there are so many other things that are happening. We are now talking about a rising debt problem. We don't seem to have a solution yet because we are saying we are using the traditional methods. My fear, another risk is that it will take us 20 years to come up to some form of resolving this problem. And in the time that we are waiting and we are talking about it in all these conferences, children will be dying, people will be dying, and infrastructure will be deteriorating, and people will have problems. And that's what we should deal with. And that's why this is urgent, that we should not wait another 14 years as we did in the HIPIC crisis.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Buckheit.
As I see it, the principal risk is this. No sovereign in the 21st century, whether developed or emerging market, borrows money in the expectation that they will have to repay the money. If by repay it, you mean apply current government resources to retire the liability. They borrow in the sure and certain hope that when that debt matures, they will have access to some capital market from which to borrow again at a tolerable interest rate to refinance what they borrowed before. And when that matures, it will be refinanced and so forth. What that means, though, is that both the debtor countries and their investors are taking the risk that when these debts mature, and by the way, the bond market actually prefers bullet maturities, instruments that are repayable in full on a day certain in the future, that when those instruments mature, that the markets will be open to them and will be able to refinance them at a tolerable interest rate. Now, here's the fragility inherent in that. The markets turn skittish for a lot of reasons, only some of which are related to the debtor country itself. They will turn skittish if there's a Lehman moment. They will turn skittish if some other sovereign somewhere else in the world encounters grave misfortune or misconduct. They can turn skittish for a lot of reasons. The commercial bank lenders of yesteryear were generally not prepared to take this risk, and they structured their loan agreements so that they would amortize over time, and when you finally got to the last installment, it was a digestible size. Here we have a debt, virtually worldwide, a debt stock that is premised on the assumption that refinancing at tolerable interest rates will be possible. And therein lies great fragility in the international system.
Good. That's a good opening. Let me ask my first question to you then, Mr. Butler. Do you think the current system, let's assume that mitigation doesn't always work, that there is another debt crisis looming out there, as
Order filled.
Has said. Is the current system fit for purpose?
The current system has worked tolerably well. And if you look just at the last 20 years, which is a period during which most of the emerging market debt that has been restructured was bond indebtedness, we've gotten quite good at restructuring bond indebtedness. The great risk there, I think, is that for political reasons or as a result of concerns about contagion, the official sector is pushed into a situation where it has to bail out, or doesn't have to, but does bail out private sector investors. And that sends a signal to the private sector that insensibly an official sector guarantee has wrapped itself around the debt of certain countries, which we call them geopolitically important countries. And that's a dangerous situation.
Do you see any role for legal changes in some of the key jurisdictions, such as London or New York?
Well, I do not see any significant change in political sentiment as it relates to ideas such as the sovereign debt restructuring mechanism that was proposed in 2002 and 2003. There may be legal changes that will, let's phrase it this way, encourage full creditor participation in a sovereign debt workout. The great concern in the world of bond indebtedness is the holdout creditor and the damage that they can do to the process and to the country. Minimizing holdout creditor behavior is therefore the prime directive for the modern sovereign debt restructure.
Okay. Minister, when a country does get into difficulty, how easy is it for it to get access to options to restructure the debt? I mean, is that a possibility? Is that open to a...
I think I should start by saying that Benin is not going through that crisis. Right?
No, I asked you this question because Benin is actually
lucky enough, I have not been through that type of situation. But so
let's take an example. I mean, Mozambique has got currently got a very serious problem caused by weather-related events. It's had the tuna bond crisis. It's a country that's
yeah.
So in those circumstances, how difficult would it be for Mozambique to?
I mean, I think there is no universal way to deal with this type of situation. Huh? There is, it's not like what we have for private sector where you have the Chapter 11 framework, you apply it, and then you go. I mean, when it's come to sovereign debt crisis resolution, each situation is unique. And the diversification of source of financing, the nature of the lenders, the nature of the debt, the cause, the root cause of the crisis will actually impact the way and the rapidity of resolving the issue. So right now, what I want to say is we talk about the risk, and the main way to prevent and to resolve the issue is to work on prevention. How do we prevent the crisis to come? And you have the responsibility of each government, and then also for international institution. When it comes to government, we as government want to make sure that we have clear debt management rules, framework inside the countries to make sure that we actually anticipate the risk of default And by anticipating the risk of default, that's what we did last year in Benin. We actually go through the debt reprofiling, to make sure that all the short-term maturities got, pushed to a long period to make sure that we don't have a pressure on the budget, right? So that's one. The second thing I want to say is, every single time you mention Mozambique, every single time a crisis starts, what I found very strange is that you start with a stock of debt, and then you have lenders coming in saying, oh, this government owes us this amount. So you have contingent liabilities and undisclosed debts raising, in the book. And that's also an element that may complicate the resolution of the crisis. So also, how do we prevent that? We prevent that making sure that we, at the government level, we have very transparent budget processes. The state-owned entities that are monitored very well, and any contingent liabilities are, monitored, and we know exactly what's the debt level. What's happening is, how can you resolve the debt if you don't have a clear view on what are you talking about? What's the amount of the debt? You start with the default, and then you have lenders coming in with other issues, and it takes time to first find out the level of, the length of the situation, and then making time to resolve the issue. The other thing also is we've seen diversification of source of financing, and each of the lenders, they have their own interest to protect. So I said at the government level, we should work and have a clear framework of debt management. And then when it comes to international institutions, the question is how do we work to have a clear framework of resolving this type of situation? I don't think we right now have a clear, standardized way of resolving the issue. And if we don't have that type of framework, every single time a situation is raised, the first lender to come will be the first one to manage and get paid, and the rest will be in trouble.
Okay. Dr. Bukosi, do you think the system is fit for purpose?
Yeah, let me start by what he says, that there is no system, actually, that would resolve a big crisis. What we have is a case by case. And the problem with that is that coming from Africa, where we believe that the only way we are where we are is because there was a huge debt cancellation program, thanks to the people that actually crafted that, the IMF, the World Bank, and everybody else, we don't see another HIPIC moment. There's not going to be another HIPIC moment coming forward. Therefore, we need another structure that can actually deal with that. Not all loans in Africa, as the minister says, are actually under the jurisdiction of London or New York. You have the Chinese, and there are so many lenders coming in. And as he said, when a default comes in, what do you have? You have other people springing out from nowhere and saying, you owe us that, you owe us that. And in that context, that's why we have been calling for a debt workout mechanism that should have a few principles. And one of the things that's important is we're not sure about how it can be, but if it could have the principle of independence of arbitrators, because then we know no creditor takes preference over the other. We want a system that can actually be transparent, a system that allows everybody to participate in that process, a system that actually ensures that when a government is going through that particular process, there is independent arbitrators, but the state does not abrogate on its responsibilities to the nation. What I'm talking about is that process should not lead to a government cutting down on expenditure and other things that actually would be infringing on the rights of these very citizens who those loans were actually taken for. So if there is a debt workout mechanism of that kind, like the principles that UNCTAD has been working on, similar to what, I know the IMF flirted with some of that during, was it 2003, Annie Kruger? There was that type of stuff. Maybe we should reopen that debate and say, what was wrong with that? What do we need to do? But this case-by-case basis, in my opinion, is not fit for purpose. And we'll see a lot of, especially with the bond market, we'll see a lot of holdouts. And once a holdout happens, it's completely a shutdown. There is no movement. We've seen that in Mozambique, where, you end up having problems, and it's difficult to resolve. Because in the case, for example, in the case of Mozambique and Zambia, if the other official creditors actually said, okay, we are going to bail out, we're going to deal with that, what does that mean in terms of the loans that the country owns to the Chinese or other people? You don't want some creditors feeling like they're taking the cut and forgiving one country in order for that country to have fiscal space to repay another person. And that's why I'm saying the beast has changed. We cannot continue to use the same weapons we used to kill the beast that has actually evolved over time and is now more resistant to the instruments that we have.
May I add something on?
Quickly, I wanted to do Mr. Lippman.
Because you talk about principle, and I would like to add two more principles. One is maybe think about the fact that as a lender, if your debt is not disclosed and something happens, it's your issue. So as a lender, make sure that the government are disclosing your debt. So if we keep that as principle, that may be also something that will bring more transparency in the, the debt management. Second principle I just thought about was that, you just said that government are actually borrowing money to pay debt, right? Maybe one principle would be like, when you look at the budget for each government every year, to make sure that the increase of the debt should be less than the additional investment. If for a budget, a fiscal year, your investment is 100, you make sure that the increase of your debt is less than 100. If you use that as another principle, maybe we are sure that, government are not actually raising money to do bizarre things, but, that are actually going through, investment. So that just two additional principles I wanted to add.
Thank you. Mr. Lipton, Dr. Bokosi has raised the idea of returning or revisiting the idea of a sovereign debt restructuring mechanism, which the fund did think about back, I think, in 2002. Your predecessor, Anne Kruger, worked on a scheme. Is there a case for revisiting that, do you think?
I think, as Lee Buckeye has said, there's no appetite for that. When this scheme was discussed, the reluctance was not just among the advanced countries. There was reluctance among the advanced countries to make a statutory change that would make this process like an international bankruptcy process. There was reluctance as well from the borrowing countries, the then emerging market borrowing countries, who felt that in the presence of that kind of a system, their market access might be reduced. I don't see, as Leah said, I don't see changes in that approach. Now, so where does that leave us? I think it is right, as has been said, that debtor-creditor relations have been evolving. That's not new. There was a time when a renegotiation meant having a Paris Club agreement and getting a bunch of commercial banks together in a room and making an agreement with them. Then came the bondholders. Then after, in the post-HIPC setting, we do have, I think what we have seen really is that HIPC participants, meaning the Paris Club creditors, have been extremely careful in their lending not to contribute to a buildup of debts in the countries where they had already given relief. They didn't want to have to go back to their legislatures and say, oops, we have to ask you for this again. So you've seen much more increasing participation from what's been called non-traditional creditors. And in addition to the diversity of creditors, there's now a diversity of loan terms and contracts, contract terms. It includes collateral terms. It includes, in some cases, options, debt equity swap and other kinds of options. I think there are even some more complex variants out there. So I think rather what we need is to convince all creditors and debtors, as has been suggested here, to be transparent about their lending, not just the amounts, but the terms. That way, for one, countries and with perhaps some guidance from us in the World Bank, can be careful about the terms on which they're contracting so that you don't get into a situation where, as some countries have, you give up a port in a debt equity swap, or you find that there are loans that the public didn't know about, or even that one part of government contracted and another part of the government didn't know about. Then I think you have to convince, and that's tricky, you need to have both sides, creditors and debtors, being willing to be transparent about the terms of contracts. This is, in some settings, being called the Debt Transparency Initiative. I think it's really very important. Then you have to convince the new creditors who've come along since HIPC and have I think, from their standpoint, have been trying to contribute to development. Some have had some geopolitical aims too. Let's accept that.
We're talking China here, aren't we?
Well, not just China. Not just China. Not just China. I think that there are a number of countries that have been lending and investing. But they have very little experience with what happens when things go wrong. They will need to learn from this experience, number one, to be more careful about the terms on which they lend and the amounts they lend. And as in the case of China, not have one part of the government lending to country X and another part lending to country X and then finding, oh my goodness, we've got twice as many claims as we thought. I think it's very much in countries' interests to have more transparency both within their country and more public transparency. But they also need to learn that, to overcome the point that was mentioned, that the day that a country can't pay, you want to have a forum. If it's not called the Paris Club, because you don't like the name the Paris Club, you need a forum in which there can be comparability of treatment and sharing of burdens, because you don't want to be the one who gives up your claim and then find that 5 other countries were able to collect more than you were. So I think there are natural incentives here among the new official creditors, but also as between official creditors and private creditors, to have transparency, but also then to have procedures evolve. They will be new and different, but to have procedures evolve under which there can be, on a country-by-country basis, a negotiation with comparability of treatment and burden sharing. I think the other point, to circle back to your question about sovereign debt restructuring mechanism, the work that Lee worked on, that many here at the fund worked on, an approach to build contingent collective action clauses and mechanisms to avoid holdout creditors from hijacking a negotiation. So generally speaking, the interests of the debtor and the body of the creditors can be met through negotiation. That's important. It's progressing. There is more to be done, perhaps on that front, but I think that is likely to be the route taken rather than a sovereign debt restructuring mechanism.
Before I bring in Professor Lee now, just one follow-up question. Obviously, it's become a lot more complex with these new creditor countries than it was at the time of HIPC. I mean, when a country now comes to the fund in distress, and more countries in distress, is it a source of concern that the fund will be lending into a country for it to repay these non-Paris Club creditors? Is that really a sustainable state of affairs?
Yeah, but I think it's really not what happens. I think we have to decide whenever we lend whether the country has a sustainable debt, and so it can borrow from us as well and go about its business. Or whether to be sustainable, you need simultaneously to have the country's IMF-funded adjustment program, but also a treatment of their debt. And, you know, if we're making our analysis well and making these decisions properly, you don't have a situation like this where you're somehow bailing creditors out. You know, there's been plenty of concern expressed by politicians about the question, in particular cases, of whether IMF support for a country was somehow going to let one or another creditors take their money. We will try to always to make sure that there's debt sustainability. If not, that there's a treatment of the debt, and that in the treatment of the debt there's some measure of comparability of creditor treatment.
Dr. Lee, I mean, clearly the fund is not working on a new sovereign debt restructuring mechanism. What do you see as the sort of flaws in the current system, and how do you think they can be put right within what's politically feasible? Yes.
Well, there's certainly flaws in the system, and I'm sympathetic to the sort of, you know, we're not working on it now. There doesn't seem to be an appetite for it. I would point out that sometimes you don't have an appetite for something that you need anyway, and so perhaps some background work could be happening, notwithstanding the fact that countries are not actually actively calling for it. So that's one thing I would point out. The other thing I would point out is that yes, maybe it would be best to have a sovereign debt restructuring mechanism with all the bells and whistles, more akin to something like a domestic restructuring regime, but perhaps you can think of kind of intermediate elements, right? Because ideally you want a legal architecture that maps onto the underlying problems, and that's not what we currently have, right? I mean, you have global reach or lack of global reach as one of the underlying problems, you know, a single forum that's bringing everyone together. So I think trying to think about creative ways to do that is one important thing. There's no way to really enforce a global standstill. And I think, you know, is there a way to do something like that, right? Certain elements of the IMF SDRM proposal, you know, doing a modification of the Articles of Agreement to allow for the you know, calling for a standstill even without the various other things, right? I mean, would that be an intermediate step that would still be an improvement upon the current global architecture? You know, currently we have the potential for conflicting court decisions, and that's sort of a difficult thing for sovereign states to handle, and also provides uncertainty.
Is there a way around that?
Well, I mean, this is
different legal jurisdictions.
Right, exactly. I mean, this would be the more expansive with bells and whistles approach, right? Including something like the possibility of an arbitral tribunal that is sort of making consistent decisions that is going to be, you know, relevant across a whole range of jurisdictions. So something along those lines, right? And then, as others have pointed out already, we have gaps in our knowledge, right? I mean, so we need mechanisms that call for transparency, not just from sovereign state borrowers, but also from creditors themselves, right? To the extent that you could encourage creditors to, well, where is it that you are lending? Are there guarantees from the state, right? So there are a range of kind of intermediate mechanisms that I think would be helpful, and we could draw from IMF SDRM. I think you've mentioned the UNCTAD principles on responsible sovereign lending and borrowing, sort of a more explicit embrace of those principles I think would be helpful. You know, a range of things along those lines I think would help.
Okay. Let's have a few contributions from the audience. Anybody like to ask a question of the panel or a particular member? Anybody? We've got some. If you could let us know who you are, that would be good. There's a gentleman at the back, I think. There are some mics, I think. Oh, there are mics there. Okay, good.
Thank you very much for the panelists. Wonderful discussions. My name is Rama from Uganda. In the region I come from, Eastern Central Africa, the IMF has an advisory of a threshold of 50% debt to GDP ratio. And this is taken as a gold standard. Every government official will still wave and say we are still below 50%. It's okay to borrow. We still have a limit. But we know that the sustainability issue might not only arise because of that threshold you have set. There are countries in the world whose debt to GDP ratio are above 50% and it's sustainable and they can manage it. But there are those even who are below 50%, and you could see that there are indications that they will default and the economy will go bad. So why should the IMF continue to maintain this threshold even when there could be some of these indicators that this is going on? But to the Minister, normally most of the borrowings we do is for infrastructure development, usually physical infrastructures. And we put a lot of money there. In 2016, the World Bank released a report showing that in Uganda, for every $1 we are putting on the infrastructure, we are only generating about 70 cents of economic activity from that. And yet we are putting a lot of money there. Yet there are countries in Southeast Asia who generates up to about $2 to $3 per every $1 invested in that. As we continue to front load and put more money on infrastructure, and yet the returns are not showing quickly. And yet again, some of these infrastructures deteriorate very fast. In my country, there are roads which have been built with borrowed money, and they deteriorate before even the first period for maturity comes. Now you have to borrow again to make the same road. So how many times shall we continue doing this? To you, the Minister. Thank you very much.
Two good questions there. Anybody else before I...
There's someone at the other mic.
Yeah. Thank you for the panel. My name is Jesus Sanchez. I'm an international economics student at the George Washington University. The panel has been talking about the next wave of sovereign debt crisis, but however, for some countries, unfortunately, the next debt crisis has already taken place. And by that, I mean countries such as Venezuela. However, the situation in Venezuela presents an alternative political dimension which further complicates the matter on how to further restructure the debt in the future, given U.S. sanctions. There's an ongoing struggle right now on the international system on who to recognize as a legitimate authority internationally in Venezuela between the government of Nicolas Maduro and the interim government of Juan Guaido. So my question is to you, Mr. Lipton. Do you anticipate the IMF recognizing a representative from the interim government of Juan Guaido, and do you think it will help prepare the monumental task that comes when we refer to the restructuring of Venezuelan debt, or will the fund wait until there's a complete political transition in Caracas for that to take place? Thank you.
Thank you. I'll take one more and then we'll...
Okay, this is Jaime Atienza from Oxfam. We are seeing with great concern how what we can call an upcoming fiscal crisis is what we are seeing, because we see that tax collection is not growing fast, debt is growing in fact, and yesterday this morning we knew that aid is stagnating and reaching to Africa. So what we have is a fiscal problem for a number of African countries. Solving debt is one part of it, and we need to go definitely for some of these mechanisms that have been started to being considered, but we need an
order filled
to these different flows. What do you have to say from the floor on how to make sure that we get a serious plan coming from countries and with international support, plus a serious debt resolution mechanism that is being mentioned as with not much appetite, but badly needed, as I heard?
Okay. Mr. Lipton, there are a couple of specific ones for you. The 50% threshold.
Like this. There's not a single threshold for any, some kind of binding limit for any country. We, of course, have to try to generalize as best we can, but we believe that every country's debt-carrying capacity has to be analyzed on its own merits. And there are countries that have a lot of assets or have a lot of growth possibilities, and they tend to have higher borrowing capacity. And there are other countries that have to be far more cautious. And I think it is important to differentiate. We try to differentiate, and I think it's a mistaken notion that we're rigid in that respect. I think more often than not, we are dealing with countries that want a higher number. I'm sympathetic that there are many countries that need to be, for various reasons and in various settings, more cautious. On Venezuela, it's not a new problem or unprecedented problem for the fund that sometimes it's unclear with whom we are going to do business. We as an organization have to ask our membership who they want us to do business with. And at this present moment, we're in a kind of a standstill situation because the membership has not given a clear signal one way or the other. But I would add that even if they did change their view and recognize one or another figure, we can only actually help a government that's in control of the institutions and the policy instruments of a country.
Order filled.
The tragedy of Venezuela is that the country has an extreme food crisis, an extreme destabilization of prices and the exchange rate, an extreme debilitation of physical capacity, both energy, electricity, and other, as well as a loss of human capital, and a quite complex debt problem, and no one's working to fix it. So, we'd be eager to have the opportunity. We are working hard to be ready if we were asked, and if there's a setting in which we can contribute in a positive way.
How quickly could you move into Venezuela if you were asked to do so?
Well, move in is
well, help.
There's lots of different kinds of help. Some could be quick, some would be slow. I would give as an example that when the communist system fell apart in Eastern Europe, say in Poland, and there was Solidarity took over from the communists, it was 6 months of their trying to figure out what they wanted to do, taking control of government, making a plan, negotiating with the IMF, and then the stopping of a hyperinflation. You usually only get one shot at stopping a hyperinflation. So, we'll do whatever can be done on the fastest timetable possible when there's a government that wants to take the needed steps, and it's recognized by our membership.
Minister, there was a specific question to you about infrastructure spending, and that Uganda was not getting a full dollar's worth of return for its investment, and other countries were. What's your response to that?
I mean, before answering to that question, I would like to maybe give a couple of thoughts on the first question about the GDP to the debt to GDP ratio.
Yes.
I mean, I want to say that that's not the only ratio the IMF and other institutions actually use. Debt to GDP ratio is just an indication. As a matter of fact, you have countries like France where the debt to GDP ratio is over 100%. And we're not talking about debt crisis. You have countries like Nigeria where debt to GDP ratio is very low following the GDP rebasing that's happened a few months ago. So that's not the only ratio IMF use, and also there are other ratios. So two other ratios need to be considered when it's coming to debt sustainability analysis. One is your revenue divided by the GDP.
Yeah.
And the second one is actually, the one I like the most, is actually following the cash. How much are you paying over how much are you collecting? So the debt service over your revenue. So those two ratios are like a better short-term indicators of crisis coming in. So the GDP, debt to GDP is just an indication, and I agree with you, we shouldn't be putting a lot of emphasis on that ratio, especially in the context where in Africa, many countries are going through GDP rebasing. First. Now coming to the second question, and you give an example for your country where you said when you invest $1, actually the return is 70 cents. I mean, the first reason for that is what I mentioned when I began, is government overpaying for investment. When you're paying 100 for investment, which cost is actually 50, then your return will also be below. So I believe that that situation is the conjunction of two things. One is we overpaying because we don't have a transparent public procurement system. And second thing is we don't factor ab initio the cost of maintenance. When you have an investment for an infrastructure and then when you sign the contract, you make sure that the contractor will be involved in the maintenance, I can tell you that the subcontractor will make sure that he brings quality to the investment. When you sign and then they just construct the road or the infrastructure and just go, you have maintenance risk. So we should think about maintenance at the first place when we start negotiating. And when you do that, you can have enough return on your investment because the maintenance will exist and the cost of that maintenance will be low because you will have quality work at the first place. That's the two reasons. First, we're overpaying some of the investment, and secondly, we don't do a good job thinking about maintenance at the first place when you sign contracts.
Okay. We're rapidly running out of time, sadly, but I'll try and bring the other panelists in a minute. There's a couple of people waiting. If you can make your questions nice and short, I can get the panelists to respond before we run out of time.
Thank you. Will do. My question is for...
Who are you, please?
I'm Omotunde Mahoney of Rhombus Advisors, and my question is actually directed to Lee Buchheit, with whom one had the privilege of collaborating in the Jurassic era of Brady bonds. Looking specifically at Mozambique, even before Hurricane Idai battered the country with second and third order effects of the floods, the disease, the infrastructure destruction, there was a massive civil society movement, Eu não pago, I am not paying. This movement was emphatically against the repayment, indeed the obligation to repay the sovereign debt. My question is, given the illegality, forget the non-disclosure, but the fact that none of the three loans in question had been issued in compliance with Mozambican law, statutory and constitutional, what are your thoughts about the potential susceptibility of these obligations to repudiation, I think is the noun one is looking for. Thank you.
Good question. Mr. Buchheit.
First, I think that situation is being litigated now in London. I think the government has brought a case against at least one of the investment banks that put those loans together. This is a situation, hearkening back to something that David Lipton and some of the other panelists said. It highlights the importance of transparency in the incurrence of sovereign debt, but there will be situations in which debt is incurred in a manner that is inconsistent with the laws of the debtor country, or that is tainted by corruption. And those are circumstances in which I think the lenders ought to be bearing a responsibility. One of the principles in the UNCTAD principles is that the very title of the document is Responsible Sovereign Lending and Borrowing, that lenders do carry a responsibility to ensure that their credits are consistent with the laws of the debtor country, and they obviously carry a responsibility that they should not be
order filled
inducing government officials to undertake state liabilities that have no business being done.
Okay. Very last question. If you could make this nice and short, that would be very, very helpful.
My name is Grigori Pustavit. I'm from Germany. I'm representing Goethe University Frankfurt. And I have a question regarding the holdout litigation. And it seems to me that usually this question is seen very detached from what is going on, because the courts are actually enforcing the law and the idea of the
order filled.
By this I mean that courts are usually deferring to the policy of their own government and to the policy of the international institutions like World Bank and International Monetary Fund. And so far as we have the main policy of International Monetary Fund that all debts should be renegotiated voluntarily and the debt should be paid in any way before this agreement is made, we cannot ask too much from the courts to not
order filled
the agreements what we have right now. So do you think that any policy changes should be done first of all by international institutions? Thank you.
Doctor,
let me just say quickly, we do not get involved in debt renegotiation per se. What we do is we try to figure out on what terms we can help the country. And if the debt is unsustainable, we say so. And if then the country and the creditors have to negotiate, the courts may get involved. We will look upon that and then decide at some point whether we can participate. But we don't really have a role beyond that. Recognizing, however, the complexity of the holdout issue, we have worked hard to try to see that contracts can be changed, that the nature of new contracts can include collective action clauses and proper aggregation clauses that we welcomed when that countries have tried to structure their borrowing in a way that limits the risk that holdouts will cause problems. But I defer to Lee on the legal aspects of this. It's really not our business per se to get involved in the actual discussions, negotiations, or any court adjudication.
We're coming right to the end of our time. There's one final question for everybody right down the line. What one thing would make a big difference to this looming problem, if it is indeed a looming problem? If we were back here in a year's time, what one thing would actually help?
The one thing I would like to see is there is a perversity in this system. This organization, the IMF, is really unable to enforce any of its advice to its member countries until they come and darken the door of 19th Street and need a program. Until then, they can jawbone the government authorities all they want, but they really have no ability to do anything.
Okay. Dr. Bakossi.
Yes, for me,
if you can.
For me, the key is that there should be debt transparency. And I want to make one comment that is very, very clear.
Quickly if you can, because we're really running out of time.
Sometimes when we get into these discussions, there is a feeling that the problems that we're facing in debt crisis in Africa are because of the new lenders. None of the cases in Mozambique, none of the cases in Ghana, in Zambia, involve China or Russia. They are the experienced, traditional lenders who should have known better. And that's why we need another way of doing business.
Okay, Minister?
Maybe 2 words, transparency and anticipation. The best way to resolve issue is to anticipate. So.
Okay.
So I think that clarifying actually what the reasonable norms of lending and borrowing should be, I think would be very helpful. In particular, I mean, I think having a statement from an institution like the IMF that says, look, you actually don't have to pay this debt, and we would not consider that to be a reputational problem. That would be, I think, a powerful statement.
Mr. Lipton, last word to you.
I would hope we can come back here in a year and there will be significant progress on debt transparency, both by debtors and creditors. I think we do need to convince creditors that it's in everyone's interest to be transparent about debt, that they need to, we're not just talking about past claims, we're talking about future claims, and we're talking about how to do workouts when there's incomplete information. I think it would be in everyone's interest for there to be more information.
Okay. Well, that hour has really flown past. Thank you all very much for coming. Thank you very much to my panel. Thank you all.
Order filled. 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 Order filled.